Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do appreciate you being with me. We are continuing our study of the challenge of Christ. Pardon me, I've been drinking coffee all morning long. Of the challenge of Christ, and we've been focused on the concept of the appointed time. And here's the reason. Atheists, skeptics, Jews, Muslims all deny that Jesus kept his word. Now, and that word that they're talking about is that Jesus said he was going to come back in the first century in the judgment of all men. I've got to tell you, I've been corresponding back and forth on YouTube over the last several days with a guy that comes up with some of the most ridiculous arguments I've ever heard in my life. Oh, but he claims to be, all this and all that. And yet it's stunning, literally stunning, how many argumentum absurdums, and remember that's a non-Latin Latin term that I invented. And what I mean by argumentum ad desperatum is that people just make up arguments out of pure desperation. They cannot answer biblical arguments exegetically with proper hermeneutic, so they just make something up. They just throw it against the wall and hope that something sticks. And that's what this guy does over and over and over again. To give you an example, he insisted for a long time, matter of fact, I read a post from him this morning, the law passed away at the cross. Well, when I pointed out that Colossians chapter 2, 14 to 17, Paul said that the new moons, the feast days, and the Sabbaths were, when he wrote in AD 62, they were still present, active, indicative shadows of the good things that were about to come. Paul does not say they were fulfilled in Christ. Paul does not say the law was nailed to the cross. He says just the opposite. And so this guy says, no, the law was nailed to the cross. Well, when I asked him, when were the final three feast days of Israel fulfilled, Rosh Hashanah, which is the new moon feast day, and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, parousia of Christ, and Sukkot, the resurrection. Now that's what those final three feast days represented. They symbolized, they foreshadowed, they typified. Now remember, Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. So here's this guy telling us the law, with all of its commandments, the word intole, Ephesians chapter 2, 15 and following, was nailed to the cross. Well, that should mean that all of the feast days were nailed to the cross. And yet here's Paul in Ephesians or Colossians chapter 2 saying those commandments for the feast days were still valid because the good things that they represented had not yet been fulfilled. So here's what the guy does. He says the law, with all of its commandments, was nailed to the cross. But when I asked him about the fulfillment of the last three feast days, he said, they're still present today, shadows of the good things that have not yet come. When I pointed out that demands that the law, every jot, every tittle of it, remains valid today, I have asked him to explain the contradiction in his own view. On the one hand, the law of Moses in its entirety was nailed to the cross. On the other hand, we got two things going on here. On the other hand, the last three feast days are still valid. They're still shadows. They're still types of the things that haven't come yet. No less than 15 times, I have challenged him to explain his self-contradiction. He doesn't touch it. Totally, absolutely, 100% silent. Now, at this juncture, I want to remind you, I've written, I always forget how to do this. Anyway, I've written a brand spanking new book, just introduced it very last of November, and a very special introductory price. And this is for the entire month of December 2022, U.S. orders only. You go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and you order the book. Total delivered price, $12.95. That does not apply to overseas orders. Now, if you're overseas and you'd like to have a copy of it, perhaps on PDF, then contact me and I'll work with you on that under certain circumstances, okay? Here's the premise of the book. Jesus said, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled. The first century temple, Jerusalem temple, overseen and administered by the Levitical priest in accordance to the law of Moses, was standing when the first 4 feast days were fulfilled. Nobody doubts that. Although amazingly, in some brand new argumentum ad desperatum, I've had people jump up and say, temple did not have to be standing for the fulfillment of the feast days at all. And I was just staggered. But as a general rule, everyone agrees that temple had to be standing for the fulfillment of the first 4 feast days. Okay, here's the question. I posed the question over and over and over. It's on the back of the book. All right. If the temple administered by the Levitical priesthood had to be standing for the fulfillment of the first 4 feast days, why did not that same identical first century Jerusalem temple administered by the Levitical priest, why did it not have to be standing for the fulfillment of the last 3 feast days? And I tell you, folks have gone absolutely apoplectic over this. Why? Well, because virtually everyone admits the law of Moses was done away in the first century, never to be restored. So if those feast days, if those final 3 feast days had to be fulfilled while that Jerusalem temple administered by the Levitical priesthood was still standing and valid in the first century, then since it no longer stands, that means one of 2 things. It means the final 3 feast days were fulfilled, meaning judgment, second coming, resurrection was fulfilled in the first century. I don't care what our concept of it is. Or it means the promises of Christ failed. It means the typological system of the law failed. It means the law passed away without being fulfilled, in direct violation of what Jesus said in Matthew 5:17 and 18. You catch the power of that? So, I've gone over this because you see, all of this is critically important to understanding the challenge of Christ. Why is that? Because Jesus said, salvation is of the Jews, John chapter 4, 20 and following. And Jesus said, you search the scriptures, that's Torah, that's the law, for in them you think you have eternal life. If you obeyed Moses, you'd obey me. Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. But if you say the final 3 feast days have not been fulfilled, then that means the law hasn't been fulfilled. And Jesus failed. The challenge of Christ fails. So, get yourself a copy of the book, Temple to Telos. I'm telling you, this is theological dynamite. It is a theological atom bomb. No, it might even be a hydrogen bomb. And ever since I introduced it, I've been dealing with people who are searching, grasping, desperately trying, argumentum ad desperatum, trying to find an answer for my premises. They can't do it, and they failed miserably. And I've got to hurry up here, but what the most astounding thing to me is that when people just flippantly say, oh, the temple didn't have to be standing for the fulfillment of the feast days. Really? Well, I'm not going to go into all of the answers to that. As a matter of fact, in the very near future, I'm going to be revising this, okay? Now, it'll be maybe a year. I don't know, but anyway, in the somewhat near future. I'm going to be revising it, and I'm going to be responding to the strongest, to the best, most commonly offered objections to the premise of the book. Okay? So go ahead and get a copy of this book to see what I'm saying, and then be looking for a future revision of the book, because it is going to be dynamite. I can promise you. Okay. So we've been focusing on the appointed time. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1 to 3. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show to his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Verse 3. Blessed who reads and understands and keeps the sayings of this book, because the time, Greek word kairos, meaning the divinely appointed time, has come. Well, you know, I pointed out, ladies and gentlemen, how futurists have to make a mockery of language in order to escape the force of that. Now, I want you to understand something right here that is absolutely critical. Most people want to run to Revelation to talk about our future. Over the last couple of weeks, I've just had one person after another accost me over the book of Revelation. Obviously, this hasn't been fulfilled. What about the 100 million soldier army? And what about the blood up to the horses, bridles, and on and on and on? And what's been amusing is several of those people have said, Preston, you're about to find out. These things are about to happen. They're going to happen soon. And I've written back and I said, well, what do you mean by soon? Well, one person says, according to his calculations, the Lord's going to come. Revelation will be fulfilled in 2070. Well, there you go. Another prediction. Folks, this is a shame and a disgrace, and it impugns the integrity of the Bible. It impugns Jesus Christ. Over and over, how many times do people have to make false predictions like this? I wrote an article some years ago entitled Loss of Argumentation. It's on my website, donkpreston.com. Go there. Read the article. But nonetheless, people go to Revelation and they say, see, that's in our near future. In spite of the fact that at the beginning of the book, in the middle of the book, and at the last of the book, John was told by the Lord himself, these things must shortly come to pass. He said that 2,000 years ago. And over, we're told the time had come. The appointed time had come. And what I've been doing with you and for you over the last several weeks is pointing out that word kairos, that means the divinely appointed time, is used throughout the Old Testament to predict the appointed time of the end. And Isaiah chapter 60, verse 22, the Lord said, to paraphrase, when that time comes, when the appointed time comes, I will bring it to pass swiftly. In other words, when the kairos would arrive, fulfillment would follow quickly, shortly, and swiftly. Do you catch the power of that, ladies and gentlemen? Here is God in Isaiah 60:22 saying, when the appointed time came, he would bring fulfillment to reality very quickly. Jesus in the New Testament came at just the right time. He came at the appointed time. And so what I've been doing over the last several weeks is giving you several examples of how the Old Testament foretold the appointed time. I've been showing you what the appointed time really was. Daniel 2, it was the days of the fourth empire, i.e. Rome. In the days of those kings, in the days of Rome, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So that was the appointed time of the end, the days of the Roman Empire. The next passage that we went to is Daniel chapter 7. Now, I make no apologies for spending a good bit of time on Daniel chapter 7, okay? Because it's critical. Daniel 7 is directly parallel, although it gives us a lot more detail. It is directly parallel with Daniel chapter 2 because it shows us 4 beasts, and in the days of the 4th beast, a little horn arises. The little horn persecutes the saints. But judgment was set in the vision that Daniel had in the night. Judgment was set. Thrones were set. The thrones had wheels of fire. And judgment was set. And one like unto the Son of Man came on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and there was given to him dominion and power and authority and a kingdom which shall never pass away. That's Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. Now, let me remind you again. Most commentators, there is a growing number of them that have changed their mind on this, however. A growing number of commentators agree Daniel 7 is not pardon me. Daniel 7 is not, as I was raised believing, as I once taught, Daniel 7 is not a prediction of the ascension of Christ. Why? Because it's a prediction of the time of the judgment of the little horn, who was persecuting the saints. So let me reiterate something I've shared with you over the last couple of weeks. And that is, if you make Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14 to be the ascension, then you have to show where the little horn was present before the ascension, and the little horn was persecuting the saints before the ascension, and that the little horn was destroyed at the ascension of Christ. Do you realize that nobody teaches that? Absolutely nobody. Now, realizing that, because I and a whole bunch of others have been pointing it out for a good long while, William Bell does a great job demonstrating that, and others. By the way, I had a internet YouTube debate with William Vincent on Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14, whether or not it is the ascension. He affirmed that it was. I denied. Go to YouTube and just look up William Vincent versus Don K. Preston debate. And you're going to be blown away with what he admitted. I mean, he literally ran up the white flag, as it were, metaphorically speaking, and surrendered his entire argument in his second affirmative. And that was the end of that debate. Literally. That was the end of that debate. So anyway, if you take the view that Daniel chapter 7, 13, and 14 is the ascension of Christ, let me reiterate this so that you can truly catch the power of it. If Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is about the ascension of Christ, then you must of necessity, you must of exegetical, hermeneutical, logical necessity believe that the little horn was present before the ascension. He was persecuting the saints before the ascension, and that Jesus destroyed the little horn at his ascension. Nobody teaches that. So what do some people do? The very first time I heard the argument, the very first time I read the argument, I was literally stunned. I was blown away at the argumentum ad desperatum. So they argued, well, you see, and by the way, Steve Gregg does this somewhat in his book, Why Not Full Preterism. He doesn't seem to be as overt about it as others are, but he takes the position that Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is about the ascension of Christ. But wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen. what you have to argue if you take that position, I've already pointed out the first part of it, but if you take that position, you have to believe that Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is a totally independent prophecy of the ascension of Christ that is just arbitrarily, capriciously inserted into the text of Daniel chapter 7 without a single word of indication, without a single word in the text saying, well, okay, now you've seen the vision. Now let me project another prophecy. It doesn't have anything to do with the vision. It's another vision, totally unrelated to the context that I've shared with you, Daniel was saying, supposedly. But then in verse 15, what do we have? Well, Daniel said he was troubled in his night vision. He sought to know the meaning of that vision. Now, folks, I don't know how to emphasize this any more. I have interacted with an awful lot of people on this, and I have been, as I've already said, I have been literally stunned at how people try to escape the force of this. Now remember, some people are now arguing that Daniel chapter 7, 1 to 12 is a vision. But then, inserted into the text, without so much as a word, a hint, a suggestion, a shadow of a form of an indication, verse 13 and 14 are inserted in there as a totally independent vision. But then, in verse 15, we really have another vision, which is the interpretation of the first vision. And, you just have to sit back and shake your head in wonderment and amazement at how people could come up with such ideas. Well, that just demonstrates the power of prejudice. It demonstrates powerfully the power of tradition. I mean, look, I was raised believing and teaching Daniel 7, 13, and 14. That's the ascension. But when I realized it was about the judgment of the little horn, I had to change my mind. Is that challenging at times? Of course it is. But if we really, really want to be Bereans, we've got to be willing to change our mind. Now, got to move on. So Daniel said in Daniel 7:15, I, Daniel, was grieved in my spirit within my body, and the visions of my head troubled me. Now, watch this. He says visions. And so some have latched onto that and said, see, verses 1 to 12, that's one vision. Verse 13 and 14, that's another vision. Well, if that's so, okay, then since we have the interpretation of verses 1 to 12 in verses 15 and following, why don't we have the interpretation of verses 13 and 14 given to us? But wait a minute. After giving the interpretation of verses 1 to 12, and after receiving the interpretation of that vision in verses 15 through 27, here's what Daniel wrote. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Where's the interpretation of Daniel 7, 13, and 14 if it is a different vision from that of verses 1 to 12? Daniel didn't ask for the interpretation of one vision. Yes. He asked for the interpretation of the visions. And by the way, when you do a word study of visions, or vision or visions, in the book of Daniel, you'll find that visions is an example of heterosis. Well, there's a big word for us. What does heterosis mean? Heterosis is a literary device when a single is used for a plural or a plural is used for a singular. I mean, it's a well-known literary device, ladies and gentlemen. It's used throughout the Old Testament and the New. And so when people try to build a case upon the fact that Daniel says visions, that must mean multiple visions of different things to happen at different times, they are absolutely ignoring the common literary device known as heterosis. Once again, heterosis is when a singular word is used to refer to multiple realities, or a plural is used to speak of a singular reality. By the way, Hebrews 9:24, the writer, in speaking of the sacrifices of the Day of Atonement and those multiple sacrifices, the writer says, now it was only fitting that the things in the heavens would be purified with better sacrifices, plural, than these. Well, what was the better sacrifice? It was the one time, for all time, singular sacrifice of Jesus. But wait a minute, he uses the plural. It was necessary that the things in the heaven be purified with better sacrifices. So if somebody's going to argue that, well, visions in Daniel 9 has to refer to multiple visions of different things at different times, let me reiterate, they're absolutely ignoring the common literary device known as heterosis. Now, look, I'm out of time. Do yourself a favor. Go to Daniel 7, verses 15, and read all the way through the end of the chapter, and we'll get directly to it next week. In the meantime, you have a fantastic weekend. I'll see you next week.